Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation, the podcast that explores the reality of a word that is in danger of losing its meaning altogether. This podcast is produced by Outlast Consulting, LLC, a boutique consultancy that helps companies use innovation principles to solve their toughest business problems. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm so excited to have Chris Skinner. Chris Skinner is a best-selling author, independent commentator, and globally sought-after expert on financial markets and technology through his critically acclaimed website, The Financer. He has been voted one of the most influential people in financial technology by the Wall Street Journal's Financial News, and has been an advisor to the White House, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the United Nations. He is a visiting lecturer with Cambridge University, as well as a TEDx speaker, and is chair of Nordic Future Innovation and a non-executive director of 11FS. A regular commentator on BBC News, Sky News, CNBC, and Bloomberg, Chris is also the author of 16 best-selling books, including Digital Bank, ValueWeb, and Digital Human, as well as a children's book series, Captain Cake and the Candy Crew. His newest book, Digital for Good, Stand for Something or You Will Fall, will be released on June 1st, 2022. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jared. Great to be invited.
Well, why don't we dive right in? What, in your mind, is innovation?
Well, innovation is where you have an idea that's new, that's actually executed and realized, because there's thousands of ideas out there that are never actually implemented. So you have to actually implement and execute. But at the same time, it needs to be something that's new. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's new technology or completely new to market. It can take things that exist already, just do it in a different way. My favorite example was when Apple came up with the iPod. At that time, showing my age, I was using MP3 players. But what they did is they took the idea and did it in a new way, which was in a beautiful form. And that made it something that created the Apple that we know today.
Right. Yeah, I remember those. I can't think of the name of the company. I feel like it was Creative River or something like that, that actually had the first real best-in-class MP3 players at the time. But Apple, yeah, definitely.
I think the other thing is the vision that went behind that. Because I remember going into a electronics shop in about 2003 and asking for a new MP3 player. And they said, oh, we don't stock those anymore because who wants to download music from the internet? It's too difficult. And you look at how we live today and you realize how limited the vision was of that store at that time.
Wow. Yeah. And it also points out to your point that the innovation is bigger than the product, because they stopped selling it, not because of the features of the MP3 player, but because of the complexities around loading it and filling it with music. And
the most successful innovations are of their time, in that there's a lot of innovation that I've been involved with that was before the market was ready. When is prime time? Apple got that right with the iPod and with the iPhone. And that's really where success comes from. And they're not the only company that does it. I mean, you can look at other companies like Tesla and more and say, when is prime time for these technologies and these innovations to hit the market and for the market to be ready for them?
Sure. Is that something you can actively manage, do you think? Or is that something you just have to hope that serendipitously comes along with what you're developing?
I don't think it's hope so much as tracking and checking and tracing what's developing and seeing when it makes sense. So by way of example, I was heavily involved in biometric financial services in the 1990s, way before it was ready for the market. The moment wasn't there.
Wow.
And yet today we're very happy to use our face and our finger to ID.
Right.
So it's the form factor, it's the technologies, it's the markets, it's the ease and ability to use, and whether it's something that the customer's comfortable with as an experience.
Right. And so would you say that that technology in the 90s that you were developing, would you consider that innovation or no?
I would say, yes, it's innovation, but it wasn't able to reach mainstream.
I see.
And so it goes back to what I was saying about a real innovation is something that hits the market and is accepted and adopted. I would say we were developing ideas, but they weren't innovations. They were ideas that weren't actually ready for market.
I see. Okay. So today's biometric security innovations are innovation decades in the making, basically, is what I'm hearing.
Well, it's interesting because when you look at the history of anything that you see today, it's been decades in the making. I mean, people rave about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. That actually started back in the 1950s. It's not anything new.
Wow.
It's just that it took a long time to get to where it's got to today. It's still got a long way to go.
Interesting. So that really does reinforce the sort of time element and things being of their time. And sometimes a technology might be out of place, or an idea might be ahead of its time, or it could be late to the party. But once all the elements come together, then the innovation can come to life.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's annoyed me for quite some time in financial services because I've dealt with banks for most of my career. And they often dismiss a technology because they say, oh, we tried that and it didn't work.
Right.
And the fact is that technologies are continually moving forward. And it doesn't matter if you tried it and it didn't work. That was like 10 years ago. Try it again, try it again, try it again until it's ready for prime time.
That makes a lot of sense. I think the 3G, 4G, 5G evolution of internet speeds on your phone probably brought a lot of technologies that weren't ready, brought them into a context where they could support innovation.
Yeah, I mean, the mixture of cloud computing and the smartphone really enabled us to have this unlimited capacity to communicate and connect and network. And one of the visions I had over a decade ago is the collapse of supply chains because of 3D printing.
Right.
How many of us are doing 3D printing at home these days? I mean, I don't. But having said that, one day I probably will. I just don't know when. I'm waiting for that technology to reach mass market. So it's really all about, some things are obvious. It's obvious from a security perspective that using biometrics makes sense. It's not obvious when it's intrusive and it doesn't work well. Now it's got to the stage it's not intrusive and it does work well. So you have to just continually revisit and see what's happening.
I see. It seems like it would take a lot of patience and maybe humility to kind of take that view of things.
Possibly. I guess because I've always been looking at the future, and particularly from a technological and societal perspective. I couldn't guess tomorrow what's going to happen economically and politically.
Sure.
But socially and technologically, there are some things that are blindingly obvious that are going to happen. It's just a case of when. And you just need to be practical and apply your thinking in a way that says, I've got no preconceived ideas, even though I might have tried this before. I'll try it again. And I'll just keep looking at what's going on here and see if there's something, particularly if it is blindingly obvious, like facial recognition, for example. When can we make this work?
Right.
I don't know if you saw it, Mastercard is now rolling out a facial recognition payment system. So you don't actually have to have a card, you just smile at a camera and that's your payment.
I did not see that. Wow. So that's something that's in development or is headed?
No, they've rolled it out prime time. It's already out in China with Alipay, which is the biggest payment system in China. And Mastercard's picked up on that. And now they're rolling it out into Europe and America. So things happen very quickly overnight, but they take 50 years to get there.
Unbelievable. Yeah, exactly. An overnight sensation, decades in the making.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. That also brings up an element of innovation that I would love to get your thoughts on, is reapplication. What is the role of reapplication in innovation as you think about your definition?
So I just need to ask, what do you mean by reapplication?
Like the reapplication of technologies. There's this concept of, a lot of people equate innovation with invention. And what you just described to me was a great example of reapplication of, this technology worked here, let's reapply it here.
Okay. Yeah. So innovation isn't invention. That's two very different things. A lot of inventions take place a long time before the innovation of those inventions hits the market. And when you ask about reapplication, it's really saying, how can we use something that's been maybe created left field over here in the right field over there?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and a good example is things like the use of the smartphone and apps in banking, which is my main territory. Took quite a while to take off because people were worried about security. The more layers of security you could add that were non-invasive and convenient, easier it became to use apps in financial services. I'll give you one specific example, which is I never used the wallet apps on my smartphone until the pandemic hit. And the reason I use them now is that I can carry 10 debit and credit cards as cash on my phone without having any plastic or cards on my body.
Right.
And during the pandemic, I found that incredibly useful because I didn't want to touch cash. I didn't want to touch terminals. Everything is contactless in my country.
Right.
And so that became a really good way of seeing how to get through the pandemic with hygiene. I think a lot of things happened during the pandemic that turbocharged digital transformation and made everything convert very quickly to become online, delivered to the home.
Right. Where necessity becomes the mother of invention, it's also the mother of innovation probably as well.
Yeah, I mean, I survived for 2 years without leaving my room near enough, thanks to being able to use online ordering.
Exactly. And it's really interesting to look back at the last 2 years and think about how quickly things became different and then how quickly we adjusted to them in the grand scheme of things.
I might get the numbers wrong, Jared, but in the UK, about 6 million banking app downloads occurred in March, April 2020, which was a 12% rise.
In the UK alone?
In the UK alone. It was a 12% rise in the use of banking apps in 1 month. As you say, necessity is the mother of innovation.
Unbelievable. There's all these phrases and terms, the next normal, the new normal, getting back to this and back to that. I look at numbers and statistics like that, and I think, what are one of the unintended consequences, but what are the new habits and behaviors that we as consumers and users have learned over the last 2 years that we are not going to walk back from? There's a lot of talk about going back to old ways of doing things, but a lot of the things we've taught ourselves to do in the last 2 years seem to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we will go back to some of the usual things, such as the fact that conventions and conferences and exhibitions still make sense. That's my business. That's what I do for a living. And what I've missed is that human connection. You know, on a Zoom call, it's all well and good, but you don't get the water cooler conversations, which are the coolest conversations.
Exactly.
That's the bit that really works, the offline discussion. But for most of our hygiene habits of ordering and being online, making calls, I mean, digital works, like we're having this conversation now. One of the things that got me during the pandemic was how quickly everyone moved to video calling versus the old way of using Skype or whatever it was you used, voice calls. And I actually retaliated against that because I didn't want to always be on video. I quite enjoy being just a voice. So there's some habits that will stay and some that will go. And I'm not sure about the future of some of the big video calling platforms, but certainly online ordering, using online services, being digital, getting everything delivered, and using apps for accessing finance. I think people are a lot more comfortable and confident now, 2 years after the pandemic, than they were 2 years ago.
Agreed. I really like that you highlighted, as we brought all these new technologies in and drove adoption, that doesn't mean that everything's going to stick where it is. We will come back to an equilibrium as a society at some point. It won't be back to in-store shopping at the same level as we did before, but we likely won't be doing as much online as we're doing now.
And that's my biggest concern right now is what happens to the main street, because banks who I deal with are all shutting branches as quickly as they can because they cost too much.
Right.
Most of the big retail store networks are closing, including in the big malls. You kind of ask yourself, what's left? Starbucks and restaurants.
Right, exactly. Do you think that there's a role to be played? What do you think that should land, the branch versus online? Like, where do you think, maybe should's not the right term, but what do you think the natural state of things would be? I
was saying 30 years ago, again, showing my age, but back in the mid-90s, I was working for a company that was called NCR. You may have heard of them. They do cash machines.
Yes.
I'm not sure that we need those anymore. And I was charged with a strategy for the future of the cash machine. One of my conclusions was that we probably need 20% or maybe even only 10% of the branch network for the financial industry, because it can be replaced using automated technology services. I was way ahead of the time back then because we didn't have the technologies that we have today. It's absolutely obvious today that at least 4 out of 5 bank branches are going to be shut down. Because you have to sit back and think, why do you need that?
Right.
And the answer is, well, you need that because financial services is an interesting psychological thing. It's the second most important thing in our lives behind our family, because it provides us with that stability to have a partner, a family.
Right.
And I remember meeting one bank that was a digital bank in Europe, and they were opening branches as a digital bank. And I said, why are you opening branches? And they said, well, because where we have a branch, we get 3 times the number of assets stored in the bank than where we don't have a branch. In particular, it's for marketing and for trust.
Interesting.
It's not about advice. It's not about service.
Right.
Marketing and trust.
So for them, it made them more trustworthy and kept them top of mind for people on the street and moving about in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I mean, I could have a bank branch that was never open, but just had the brand on the front of the branch so that people said, oh, yeah, this bank exists. It's real.
I'll go home now and get online and put my money in there.
There you go.
The psychology of that is fascinating. So I can imagine these banks approaching from these two extremes, finding some sort of equilibrium over time, the online realizing they could use some of the trustworthiness and the solid view of being a solid institution that comes from having a physical location, and the overhead and the expense and the upkeep and all those things for the established traditional institutions probably push them back toward the center as well.
So put it in context, and it really struck home to me, and this is like 10 years ago, so it's not new, but I was dealing with a Dutch bank, and they were starting to shut down rural and urban branches. And they gave me a figure of one of those branches, which was on average, it would peak at 20 customer visits a day, but had 2 staff. And you kind of go, that just does not make sense to have that overhead.
No.
So what you then end up thinking is, so if I need to have a physical presence for marketing and trust, where do I need to have it? And obviously where you have it is where the major footfall is going to be.
Right.
And everything else becomes irrelevant.
Right. So it's solving a different problem. And so you would probably approach it differently, even if you still have 100 branches.
Especially now that everyone is downloading the apps and using them because of the pandemic.
Exactly. So you talked about seeing the trends moving in this direction decades ago. How do you think about the future when you look at the tech side of the financial industry? Are there any sort of views that you have 20, 30 years out from now that you think are trends that are going to stick?
I think the main one is that most banks should have done digital by now. I know that most banks have not,
right,
but they should have done it by now. By way of example, most banks did sign up for cloud computing in the pandemic because they had to, but they didn't do anything different. They just took what they were doing before and put it into the cloud.
Oh.
I had one bank the other day proudly telling me about 80% of their systems are and infrastructures in the cloud. And I'm going, well, that's just tin. What have you done with your business processes?
Right.
Have you changed those to adapt to digital and cloud? And the answer was we haven't. And I got this feeling very strongly that what we should be designing today is for customers on Mars, a head office on the moon, and our people on Earth, because that might as well have been the way it was for the last 2 years,
right?
Because no one was leaving home, and that included customers and staff,
right?
And we didn't need a head office because no one was going in there,
right?
And that's really the way we should be designing our processes and business for the next generation. And if we haven't done that already, then that's what we should be doing. But specifically within this, what's happening with FinTech and cryptocurrencies is the fragmentation and decentralization of finance. And we talk about this a lot, but there's 18,000 cryptocurrencies out there, 10,000 are active, there's 26,000 FinTech startups out there, many of them doing a great job. And when you look at the amount of money going into those companies, $210 billion last year was sunk into FinTech startup ventures.
Wow, that's just the venture money.
It was all the private equity and venture money.
Yeah.
In 2016, I was talking about $25 billion being invested. So you look at those numbers and you just go, something is changing here.
Yeah.
And what I keep saying is you've got 26,000 companies now doing one thing really well through an API or an app or through data analytics. Apps, APIs, analytics is the way in which I structure my thinking between front, middle, back office. And those 26,000 companies are hot off the mat because they had the vision, and they've created something that's rocking and rolling, and it's brand new, of which, of those 26,000 companies, 136 are unicorns. And there were only like 35 a couple of years ago. So they're massively growing.
Wow.
And when you think about banks that try and do everything end to end and control everything end to end, you just go, well, that's not going to work anymore, guys.
Mm-hmm.
You need to start thinking about what's called open banking, which is where you bring in apps, APIs, analytics of these startup companies doing one thing brilliantly well that you can't do because you're not good at code, you're not good at technology. Bring it in and deliver the best customer experience ever. Otherwise, the customer will go and switch to someone who does.
Right. It feels like that's this whole mantra of, disrupting yourself, that whole thing about disrupting yourself before someone else does. This explosive growth with these 26,000 companies. If I'm one of the big players and I see the amount of money that's flowing into that and the amount of flexibility and speed and talent that those companies have, to me, it almost feels like I need to learn more about this so that I don't miss the boat.
I mean, I write a blog every single day because I'm a nerd and I'm stupid. I've been doing that for 15 years.
Amazing.
But one of the most popular blogs I wrote was the best job in banking is chief Cannibal officer. And the whole idea was you need someone who can go around the company, and this would apply equally to any company, and just start picking on things and asking why you do it that way, and what appears to be stupid probably is stupid. So change it and do it a different way.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I think a lot of times we get stuck in this definition of innovation that implies product. When companies look around and they listen to these calls and read these explanations of the quarter and all that stuff, they use the term innovation, but they're always talking about their product. And it's rare that you hear someone talk about applying an innovation lens to the way they go about their day-to-day work. And I think what you just described is exactly right. Applying that lens internally would lead, I think, a lot of big companies to different places.
I mean, you can innovate product, process, service, structure.
Exactly.
And a good example is I was calling a company the other day, and as usual, I got the message, we're really busy with lots of customers right now. You are the 8th customer in the queue. We'll get you in about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I hung up and went on their website, and the chatbot came up. I thought it was a chatbot. It turned out to be a human being.
Wow.
Answered my question in a couple of minutes. So that to me is where we start to get an interesting fissure around innovation, because where I think innovation will really differentiate is if you use it to give customer satisfaction quickly. Most customers are not satisfied right now. We all know that if you get a message saying, we've got so many calls right now, we'll get to you eventually, that's because they're not hiring enough people to answer customer calls.
Exactly.
So can you innovate around that? Yes, you can, using a chatbot, but it's not a chatbot. It's a mixture of maybe a chatbot and a human. And so you need to look at process and service as well as product.
I couldn't agree more. The investment in innovation around your structure and your service and those things ultimately pays off in the customer experience as well. So yeah, that's a great example. We've talked about what innovation is. I'd love to hear from you a bit about what isn't innovation.
What isn't innovation is where an idea is not executed or implemented and it doesn't hit the market in prime time and take off. And it goes back to, and I'm culpable of this myself, I've had many, many, many great ideas, but I've never actually delivered them, or not at the right time in the right place to the right market. So you can have an innovation, but it has to be something that really gets customer traction. And maybe the best example is some of us will remember the old Blockbuster DVD stores.
Oh, yes.
I had an idea way back when that streaming would replace it, but I'm not the founder of Netflix. That guy is the guy who took the money. When you look at the history of Netflix didn't start off as a streaming video company. It started off as a DVD distribution company. They had to make that switch. It's really interesting. I remember listening to the Andreessen Horowitz A16Z podcast where they had, I think it's Ian Morehouse, who was head of Netflix streaming cloud services, talking about how that happened. And it was just an amazing gamble, which might not have paid off, but they gambled at the time to move to cloud streaming services, just as cloud streaming services were ready for prime time.
Right.
So it's being in the right place at the right time And it isn't innovation if you don't have a customer.
Right.
You've got to have a customer.
That is so true. I think the Netflix example is a great one. I remember I was at Procter & Gamble during those days, and a senior in the innovation group and one of the senior leaders in the innovation space went to some conference, and he came back and he said, yeah, the CEO of Netflix spoke, and he was talking about streaming movies directly to televisions in our living rooms. And this sounded like the most ridiculous thing on the planet. The company had just started and they were mailing CDs, and very few homes even had broadband at the time. And so I think having the vision and the sort of nerve to speak out loud about this stuff so far in advance and to already be thinking past DVDs, which I think is what did Blockbuster, and is you have to, as Wayne Gretzky said, you have to skate to where the puck is going. And I think that Netflix is a great example of a founder.
I'm going to challenge you here, Jared.
Sure.
Can you remember what year it was that your colleague heard the Netflix guy?
Oh, I can do some basic math. It was early 2000s.
So I can remember something distinctly because I'm a big David Bowie fan.
Sure.
Bless his soul. Now he's gone.
Yeah.
But I remember being at home in, I think it's 2004. It might have been 2003. Dialing in using AOL.
Oh my goodness.
Modem with all that clickety-clackety crap. And watching a Bowie concert online. And I just thought, that's where we're all going, guys.
Yeah.
But I didn't execute or implement. I don't have a customer. So that's the reason why I'm still sitting here talking to you.
That's a great concert. If I were going to go online and watch a concert, David Bowie would be on the short list. That's for sure.
Oh,
yeah.
Fantastic performance.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an interesting conversation because he spoke in such consumer-based terms. He didn't talk about broadband. He didn't talk about internet. He talked about being able to turn your television on and have movies available to you on your television.
You may have seen it because you sound like you have, but he did an interview with the BBC in 2001 or thereabouts, where he was talking about the impact the internet would have on music and saying artists will no longer make money out of their records. So everything will be available online and streamed to home. And what we'll have to do is start to up our game.
Yeah.
And it was so visionary. If you can dig that out on YouTube, it's on YouTube somewhere. But watch it, because that was 20 years ago, guys. It's not like yesterday. It's 20 years ago.
That is unbelievable. The changes in the music industry over the past 20 years are also as dramatic as streaming, because the business model of music has evolved dramatically as well, which is what he was calling out. But to think about how people made money 20 years ago being a musician in no way, shape, or form resembles the way things work today.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really down to doing the tours, being on stage live, selling the brand.
Right.
And the music is the byproduct.
Right. Yeah. I mean, absurd numbers that people are quoting on what they're making from hit songs on streaming is just shocking. So the Netflix example is an important one. I wonder if there's a way to, in the FinTech space, I wonder if there's a way you could help me think differently or understand sort of what's going on behind the scenes, right? Because I know now that I can't remember the last time I've been into the branch of a bank, but what behind the scenes, what kind of innovations have happened that have led me to this point as a consumer?
There's a number. I mean, if you look at the 26,000 plus companies that are out there, some are trying to make what banks do badly work well. And the highest value one of those is Stripe, which is a payments service online.
Sure.
10 years old, worth $95 billion. In fact, probably worth $200 billion today, because it was $95 billion a year ago.
Wow.
And all they do is they just make it really simple to add payments into any service that's digital.
Right.
And they do that globally, and they do it brilliantly well. And one of the things I always say about them is that their code is designed in a way that's beautiful. It's like art. And that's why people like it. You've got other companies like Klarna, which is the buy now, pay later pioneer, and that's been copied worldwide. You've got a number that are, instead of trying to fix what banks do badly, they're trying to replace banks, or at least offer banking to people who never had access to banking before. So my favorite example in that space is from Brazil, a company called Nubank, NU Bank.
Yeah.
They did an IPO end of last year with a valuation of $50 billion, which means they're one of the biggest Brazilian or South American companies that's ever come out of that space.
Wow.
And one of the things they did, which I think is beautiful, is they said when they launched, which is back 2015, and again, think of the numbers, 2015, and they're now worth 50 billion 6 years later. But they said it's ridiculous in Brazil that banks charge so much for credit cards. Typically, you pay $20 a month to have the pleasure of having a credit card.
Wow.
And the CFO said, if banks are Darth Vader, then credit cards are the Death Star. And that's what they targeted, to blow up the Death Star. And they did it. And they succeeded in offering a credit card with very low fees from day one. And then they got a banking license, and now they have 45 million customers across a number of countries in South America.
Unbelievable.
Then you have a number of others that are focusing on financial literacy and financial inclusion. In fact, Nubank provides financial inclusion, but particularly in the African nations, you find a lot of companies growing very quickly to offer financial services through the mobile network, of which the most famous one is M-Pesa, but there's many others.
Okay.
M-Pesa was in Kenya. And then you have the story happening in China and across Asia, but particularly in China, where trillions of dollars are now moving over mobile payment networks, mainly through Alipay and WeChat Pay, which is the Tencent and Alibaba services. And what blows me away with those is they have this thing which is like the Black Friday in America, a big sales day. They call it Singles Day in November.
Okay.
And the last one they had, Alipay was processing 544,000 sales a second.
A second?
544,000 sales per second.
Unbelievable.
It is.
Staggering.
And their aim this year is to double that to over 1 million in sales.
And this is all mobile.
It's all on a mobile phone super app. It's all delivered in under 4 days. The whole day, the Singles Day, is generating, I don't know what the number was, about $45 billion of sales.
Unbelievable.
In one day.
To be able to have, I mean, just for us to have the processing power, or any company, but us as a society to have the processing power to be able to do that is staggering in and of itself.
It's not just the processing power, but the logistics and everything goes behind it.
Yeah. I
actually wrote quite an in-depth case study about them a few years ago. And I remember meeting the head of systems architecture for Alipay. And he actually used to work for Microsoft in California and had come back to China to work for Alibaba and the Ant Group, which run Alipay. And they'd hired him back to generate their fifth systems architecture to do this 1 million transactions per second for 2 billion users. 2 billion users. And as he explained it to me, I said, you're on your fifth systems architecture? And this is a company that at the time was just 14 years old, which means they regenerate and reboot every 3 or 4 years from scratch.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. But that's the Asian attitude. You don't get wedged in and locked in with legacy, which is what we have in Europe and America. You regenerate, you reboot, you keep going forward, you keep innovating.
The solution maybe in a less forward-thinking environment would be to try to figure out how to keep your existing system relevant.
Well, I call that, because I'm so used to talking to banks, Bankenstien. It's a whole load of dead parts that are stitched together, that you stitch some electricity up the backside of it to make it stay alive and dress it up in a nice suit so it looks good.
That is such an apt term, Bankenstien. I love that. It's so vivid. And growing up in the consumer goods world, I can think of a lot of platforms, physical platforms, technologies, product form factors, things that would have fit that same description where, it's dead, it, but you're still trying to make it work.
Yeah.
I love that. Before I let you go, I would definitely want to get from you any advice that you might have for innovators.
I think the main thing is you got to show delivery. It's all well and good to have ideas,
right? But
if you don't deliver, then you'll lose your job. I've seen so many chief innovation officers who think it's all about ideating. And after 18 months of doing that, they're told to walk out the door. Great to have good ideas, but if you can't deliver them, if you can't implement them, you're an overhead. So focus on what you can deliver.
That's great advice in general, and particularly great advice in the innovation space where, to your point, your definition around new, executed, and realized really emphasizes the piece that gets missed so often in our industry, in our space. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know much about the fintech space, and this has been super educational for me. And you gave great examples that will, I think, allow me and other folks to not only learn more about fintech, but also think about how to apply those principles in other industries and other pursuits. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Jared. Good to talk with you.
All right. Take care. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this week's show. You can drop us a line on Twitter at Outlast LLC, OUTLAST LLC, or follow us on LinkedIn where we're Outlast Consulting. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.